Hi everyone, my name is John. Welcome back to my channel. We only have about 3.5 more weeks of Historathon in quarter 3 at least. And Historathon, quarter 3, we are reading, for anyone who's following along or might happen to be interested in jumping in this year, wants to start quarter 4, whatever, we, at least through the end of September, we are reading books that were written in or written about the years 1500 through 1820 that are history-centric or related to history, biographies, stuff like that. And I had the idea to read something that I had recently picked up, and I floated the idea to other people in the Historathon Discord, and 2 people bit, and they were Vin from Revenant Reads, and Stephanie, who is a frequent commenter, Stephanie Cohen, and they read this with me, and we had a little subsection on our Discord where we discussed it, and I just wanted to. Of course, they already know my thoughts about it, but I wanted to share my thoughts about it with everyone else. And the book is First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country by Thomas E. Ricks. Thomas Ricks is probably best known for the books he wrote while in his capacity as a national security and military journalist, including Fiasco, the American military and adventure in Iraq, which came out in 2006. In First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country, came out in 2020, and in it he turns his attention to the excavation of the ideas that were central to the founding of the United States. He explains in the introduction that the election of Donald Trump sent him into a fit of existential angst, as I'm sure it did with many of us, which made him even more curious about how the founders drew from the ancients in their sort of collective crafting of our shared cultural patrimony. So even before I started to read, I suspected there was going to be a couple of different directions this book could go in. It could be spectacular, picking out ancient historians, poets, philosophers maybe, and carefully drawing lines between their thought and the thoughts expressed in documents like the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, etc. It could also be, and I had the sneaking suspicion that it would be, a kind of fluffy, padded, multi-part biographical cut and paste job, with the occasional reference to Aristotle or Euripides or Terence thrown in for good measure just to bear out the promise made in the subtitle. And while I can't say the book falls completely dead flat on its face, it does come across much more like the latter than the former. So the book looks at our first 4 American presidents: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Their early educations. Washington was the only one who never really had a formal education. At least he didn't attend university. And their influences, their intellectual influences. These topics sometimes hit on classical authors, but there are vast swaths of this book that don't have anything to do with Greeks or Romans or anything they thought or wrote at all. As when Ricks rather inexplicably discusses at length Washington's participation in the French and Indian War, and then the early days of his generalship during the Revolutionary War. More often Ricks draws comparisons that lack any kind of historical robustness, because Washington put the Republican cause above his own interests and declined running for a third term in office for fear it might create an appearance of tyranny. He gets likened to Cato. That's a big stretch. I need more than that to liken someone to Cato. For returning to Mount Vernon after his presidency to pick up farming, he is referred to as a Cincinnatus, or as we would anglicize the word in English, I guess, Cincinnatus. This is cute, but it's also a really bad habit that popular historians tend to have, where they will see a similarity or an affinity between two people, or two or three affinities, and then just go overboard with drawing comparisons between the two. Most people, I'm going to guess, who read this book probably don't have, maybe this is just cynical of me, probably don't have too good of an idea who Cato or Cincinnatus were, but this just doesn't really cut the mustard for rich, rewarding, or insightful history. It's thin, it's diaphanous, and it's weak, to be quite honest. Then mentioned in his in one of his contributions in the Discord post that there's a long discussion in here about how Washington uses Fabian Tactics, by which Ricks means he would more often stave off attacks from the opposing side instead of make actively offensive military attacks himself. He basically bought a lot of time and bid his time and didn't attack, but sort of waited people out and was very reserved in the way that he led an army. And because Fabius, the ancient Roman military leader, had tactics that were similar, he uses the same word, Fabian, to describe him. But just because he uses the same tactics, as Vin noted in his post, that doesn't mean that he got them from Fabius. It could just mean he was a very conservative, cautious military leader who didn't want to put the lives of the people he was in charge of in danger if he didn't absolutely need to, or some other reason. But that's just another example of him drawing connections where connections aren't really warranted or justified. We're told that Jefferson was largely influenced by thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment. For those readers who don't know how the Scottish Enlightenment differs from the German or French or American Enlightenments, he offers next to no clarification. He says that Jefferson tends toward Epicureanism, but for a modern readership that thinks Epicurean is probably a synonym for a libertine or a hedonist, instead of knowing the more strictly formal philosophical definition of Epicurean, he does nothing at all to tell us what Epicurus actually said. This would have been a perfect opportunity to mention that Stoic Cosmology, Stoic being another word that's been completely co-opted by sort of a colloquial use and divorced from its original philosophical uses, which stated that the Stoics stated that the universe operated under an internal logic that they called the Logos. This could have been dovetailed very nicely into a discussion of the founders' deism and how they thought of the divine to the extent that they did. And this could have introduced concepts like indeterminacy or randomness in the world's order. And from there, you could have looked at, like, Democritean atomism or Leucipian atomism. None of that was even mentioned in passing. And this is just off the top of my head. Okay, I have a very, very passing knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. Took a couple of classes on it in college, but mostly spent my time studying other things. This is just 5 minutes on the back of the envelope kind of ideas I'm jotting down as I write this review. None of it was mentioned in a book, which I'm sure took a year or two to write. And it makes me think, I mean, surely we could have, I mean, those connections make a lot more sense than Washington with Cato or Washington with Cincinnatus or... so Rix closes the book with sort of a list of 10 regrets, sort of a simpering list of 10 regrets brought about by our increasing lack of familiarity with classical traditions, which not only have just a tenuous connection to the book's actual main argument, to the degree that it has one at all, but are sometimes also just wildly non sequitur in nature. Number 3 suggests that we refocus on the public good. I don't think this is a lesson exclusive to Greeks and Romans, and I don't know what that means. Number 2 tells us to, very anachronistically, curtail campaign finance, and that we should drop the bizarre American legal fiction that corporations are people, and that corporations possess greater rights than people do. I'm on board with those sentiments, but what they have to do with the book, I don't know. I think one of the things, one of his fundamental claims is that by immersing ourselves in the classics more fully, we can simultaneously get intellectually closer to the founders than we are now. These are people who would have never been able to conceptualize a university education where learning Latin and Greek wasn't compulsory, or a world in which Homer was someone you sort of wince your way through in high school and hope you never have to encounter again. Picking up some Polybius or Herodotus can help us better understand the mindset and mental framework the founders were able to reference and actively did reference. Unfortunately, Rix doesn't really harness his sources in a way that makes those connections explicit. Instead, he draws thin, facile comparisons between the figures he looks at, like I've already mentioned, Washington's resemblance to Cato or Cincinnatus, or another one he likes is likening John Adams to Cicero or Cicero, and hopes that will pass for showing readers what America's founders learned from the Greeks and Romans and how that shaped our country, like the subtitle says. But it doesn't. One of the highlights of reading this was getting a chance to read it with Stephanie and Ben, two people who are really smart, really engaging, and also happen to largely agree with me about the merits and demerits of the book, although that's not what makes either one of them smart and engaging. They are so on their own terms, of course. But I just wanted to thank them for taking the time out of their own busy reading schedules and busy lives otherwise to read this with me. And if we ever do read something again in the future, I promise to try to make it something that wasn't quite this bad. To future reads. My thoughts on first principles, what America's founders learned from the Greeks and Romans and how that shaped our country, by Thomas E. Rix. Avoid, read something else on the topic. Talk to you later.